Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis and tonight I'm joined by regular guest, former member of the Scottish Parliament and member of the Scottish National Party, Maureen Watt. Hi Maureen, how's it going? How are you feeling after the election campaign's finally over?
Evening, Ben. Yes, recovering. Yeah, just wish the weather would get better. Really dreich up here in the northeast today.
It's terrible everywhere. This is like the worst summer in my entire life that I can remember, the worst summer. I hope it gets
Yeah.
better. First, we'll move to the Ukraine update on day 868 of the conflict. President Biden has welcomed the NATO member states to the 75th anniversary Washington summit, warning that, quote, Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total substitution, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. Ukraine can and will stop Putin, end quote. Biden announced NATO will provide Ukraine with 5 new strategic air defense systems, the promise coming just a day after a deadly missile strike against a pediatric cancer hospital and other civilian targets. Germany and Romania also agreed to send additional Patriot air defense systems, while Patriot parts donated by the Netherlands will enable another battery operator. Italy approved the donation of an Italian-French FMP/T air defense system. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in Washington on Tuesday and said he would, quote, fight for NATO to strengthen Ukrainian air defenses and furnish it with more F-16 fighter jets. Zelensky said he could not predict what Donald Trump would do if he regained the US presidency in November, but the whole world, including Vladimir Putin, was awaiting the outcome. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told defense industry leaders in Washington that the leaders would pledge to enable arms makers across Europe and North America to produce more. He said NATO had placed an order for Stinger anti-aircraft missiles worth almost €700 million in the name of several member states. This morning, the Ukrainian Air Force announced Russian attacks with one Iskander M ballistic missile and 4 Kh-5969 guided air missiles fired from occupied Crimea and 20 shaded drones from the Kursk region inside Russia. The announcement said that 14 Shaheeds were shot down in Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, Lyansk, and Ravine regions. Rockets also, sorry for pronunciation there. Rockets also attacked the port infrastructure of Odessa. Russian drones attacked energy facilities in Ukraine's Rivne region, the Ukrainian naval grid operator said on Wednesday morning. Russia lacks the munitions and troops to start a major offensive in Ukraine, and to do so would need to secure significantly more ammunition from its main suppliers, like Iran and North Korea, according to a NATO briefing. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Vladimir Putin that the death of innocent children was painful and terrifying a day after the lethal strike on the children's hospital in Kiev. The deadly hospital strike was likely caused by a direct hit from a Russian missile, said Daniel Bell, UN Human Rights Monitoring Head of the Mission for Ukraine. Rescue operations stretched into a second day at the Okhotsk Children's Hospital. Officials said at least 42 people throughout Ukraine were killed in Monday's attacks. Zelensky said 64 people were hospitalized in the capital, in addition to 28 in Kryvyi and 6 in Dnipro, both in central Ukraine. It was Russia's heaviest bombardment of Kiev in almost 4 months. The United Nations nuclear watchdog will hold a special meeting after Ukraine accused Russia of undermining atomic safety by shattering the radiation-equipped children's hospital, according to a confidential document seen by AFP. Children with cancer are treated at that hospital. Ukrainian drones attacked a Russian oil refinery, military airfield, and electricity substation in a joint operation by Kiev security and military intelligence agencies. So, Maureen, what do you think generally of NATO's approach to this war? Now we're seeing a summit.
Well, I think the fact that there's a summit of NATO on at the moment is really helpful for Ukraine. They can thrash out face to face what the future view of NATO and what future action can be. It's good that we're seeing countries commit more aid to Ukraine, a military aid to Ukraine. And I think the fact that President Zelensky has been asking for air defense systems for some time now is showing some fruition. And of course, had there been air defenses, the possibility is that the tragic incident of the hospital, Children's Cancer Hospital, being struck might not have occurred. How, but the point is, Russia are attacking all over Ukraine, and it's difficult to have air defenses in every single place. However, I think the kind of, hopefully on behalf of NATO, that they will not allow Putin to overrun Ukraine, because their view is that he won't stop there. So it's good that that's happening. However, in a few months' time, might we, as commentators have said, have Trump in place, and no one knows exactly what would happen to Ukraine if President Trump were re-elected.
Yeah, so just to pick up on one of the last points you made, how likely do you think it is, and do you think it is realistic, that if Russia does manage to win the war in Ukraine, it might move on to Poland and NATO members? I think that's a realistic fear.
Well, we don't know if it's Poland. We don't know if it's one of the smaller countries on the Baltic, some of the smaller Baltics. We just don't know. But the rhetoric from Putin over the years has been that he believes in the Soviet Union as it was in the past, which means that all these states are under threat. And I don't think if he manages to take over Ukraine, that stop there, because there's the restoration of the old Soviet Republic is what he wants.
Do you think it's realistic, though, given Russia's GDP and population and whatnot and military strength, that it will be able to just even have the capacity to move past Ukraine, especially given that, in 2 years they've only managed to take most of Donetsk and Luhansk?
I mean, we've got a dictator here of the most wickedness that we could possibly have in the 21st century. And regardless of his domestic situation in Russia, if you're a dictator, you can do what you like with all the resources that you have, and no one seems to stop him. So I do not honestly, given what we've seen already, believe that he would stop him.
So looking at the time, we can just move on to the Gaza update next. The Gaza Health Ministry has said that at least 38,243 people have been killed and 88,033 wounded since the 7th of October attacks in Israel. Palestinian news agency Wafa reported that at least 26 Palestinians were killed by Israeli strikes on Gaza on Tuesday. The US has said that, quote, gaps remain between Israel and Hamas on a ceasefire and hostage release deal. Talks are set to continue in Doha today and in Cairo on Thursday after an Israeli delegation headed by Shin Bet chief Ronen Bar returned from Cairo on Tuesday. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi discussed efforts for a Gaza truce with CIA Director William Burns in Cairo on Tuesday. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society has said the latest forced evacuation ordered from Israel's military has put all of its medical facilities in Gaza City out of order. The recent deaths of several children from malnutrition in the Gaza Strip indicate that famine has spread throughout the territory, a group of independent human rights experts mandated by the United Nations has said. Gaza health authorities say at least 33 children have died of malnutrition, mostly in northern areas. An Israeli airstrike on the entrance of a school-turned-shelter in southern Gaza has killed at least 31 people as a stepped-up military offensive in the territory sent thousands fleeing in search of refuge. The airstrike on Tuesday afternoon hit the tents of displaced families outside a school in the town of Abasa, east of Khan Yunis. Officials at the nearby Nathar hospital on Wednesday said that 31 people had been killed, including 8 children and more than 50 wounded. Israel's military claims that during a week of fighting in the Shieva area, it had, quote, engaged in close quarters combat with terrorist cells and eliminated more than 150 terrorists, dismantling terrorist infrastructure, and encountered and destroyed booby-trapped buildings and explosives, end quote. The U.S. Gaza aid pier is to be permanently dismantled after operating for just 20 days. The pier, which has delivered the equivalent of a single day's pre-war land aid delivers in 2 months, is to be removed in a few days' time. So, Maureen, do you think, or how close do you think that a ceasefire is in this conflict?
Oh, I wish I could say close, but I honestly don't think so. It would appear that um, Israel and Netanyahu are prepared to kill dozens of people just to get one Hamas terrorist if he and the Israeli Defense Force suspect that they have identified one, regardless of the community that he or she are living in. So the fact that Israel now controls all the borders to Egypt in the south, including the Rafah crossing, that aid is not getting through in the quantities that is needed, and therefore we have the awful situation of children dying of malnutrition. And I don't think the pier that was set up in northern Gaza to take aid directly from Cyprus is working, or at least is not able to make up any of the shortfall. So, Netanyahu has said that he sees this conflict going on till nearer Christmas, and I don't think there's any sign that he's wrong in that. Unfortunately, maybe because of other things in our own mainstream media, we haven't seen much of how the various discussions among Middle East countries to a solution are going at the moment, but one can only hope.
Moving on to our first... Excuse me? I'm not sure what you mean. I'll move on to our first story of the day. NATO summit. Starmer said he is committed to UK defence but holds back spending increase. In his first international engagement since becoming Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer is calling on NATO countries to increase defence spending in response to rising global threats. He has said that the UK government will launch a major defence spending review. However, he has been criticised for holding back on the UK's target defence spending of 2.5% of GDP, unless and until the government have grown the United Kingdom's economy. Speaking in a radio interview today, Armed Forces Minister Luke Pollard said that the UK government wanted to hit the Tories' defence spending targets, but would not do so unless there is economic growth. In his appearance at NATO's 75th anniversary summit in Washington, Starmer is hoping to underline the UK's commitment to the defence and the alliance, to defence and the alliance. He will say that further increases in spending from allies will help NATO tackle the nature of today's threats, including Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, continued instability in the Middle East, and the rise of authoritarian states. Addressing reporters in Washington, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said that this will be a historic summit, and the alliance will do more than celebrate its 75th anniversary, but, quote, make important decisions for the future. He said he expects allies to agree a substantial package for Ukraine, which will include 5 parts. NATO command to provide security assistance and training, a long-term pledge to continue sustaining support, new audiences of immediate support, new announcements of immediate support, including air defence, new bilateral security agreements, stepping up work on interoperability. Sorry, I'm not sure. Sir Keir Starmer's ambitions to increase defence spending are in stark contrast to his refusal to consider abolishing the two-child cap, despite calls for it to end by the Labour Party leader in Scotland and at Sarwar. Mr Sarwar qualified his demands by saying that he agreed with the UK government that the two-child cap and rape clause could only go when the UK government could afford it. So, Maureen, just broadly, do you think Labour is right to commit to this 2.5% increase in defence spending?
No. I have said on this programme previously that I do not believe in the figures of 2.5% overall. I think both as nations and as members of NATO collectively, each country needs to work out what it needs itself to defend its own borders and its citizens, and then collectively where there might be gaps overall as NATO defence. I mean, I think it's the wrong way of looking at it just to say that you're going to commit to 2.5% on defence spending, because I was listening to someone earlier on today who was saying that there is huge wastage already in the defence budget, and yet we have a shortage of personnel because people are not prepared to live in the disgraceful housing that is armed housing, forces housing, if you like, and the terms and conditions that they have. So you cannot increase the armed personnel if you are not going to fix things like that. So I think in this situation, Stammer is right to cacanny, if you like, and I think there's word that a different review needs to happen before the spending review. Whether that will indeed happen, I don't know, but I don't think there should be in any country a blanket 2.5% until you work out what is required and how much it will cost. Because in some cases it might be more than 2.5%.
Okay, so do you think that obviously you've not, I assume you've not looked into the numbers like specifically in terms of, costs and spending, but do you think generally the UK should be spending more on the military? Do you think it's just the arbitrary number that you have a problem with?
Every country's first objective and first requirement is to keep its citizens safe and control its borders. So, international situations change. We've been told that we're no longer in a post-war era, but a pre-war era. So countries taking that into account. But what I'm saying is that there's lots of spending in the military which is wasteful. And, I would put nuclear submarines and nuclear armaments in that category. So there needs to be a review of what currently the money that goes into the military is spent on, and why there is such huge wastage, as we know, on defence contracts. So, but if you have to be realistic here. If there is a threat to the security of these islands, then you need to address that.
Yeah, I definitely take your point in the waste. I can imagine, I'm sure there's a lot of it. But do you think that there is a viable threat to the United Kingdom at this point? I mean, as you're saying, you're right. There is a lot of rhetoric saying that there is a viable threat to the United Kingdom. And there's a lot of rhetoric in every country in Europe saying that. But do you think that rhetoric is accurate, given how far away Russia is from us? Do you think it could actually threaten the United Kingdom?
Well, I don't have the internal information, but I do know that you can see Russian ships off our coasts in the north here, in the north coast and the northeast coast, and in the west coast. So it's not as if there aren't Russian, it isn't military or naval action near us at any one time. So they may physically be far away from us. I don't know how far long-range missiles go these days, but we have to be constantly vigilant.
No, I take what you're saying, but I think at the same time, would you think there might be a danger of the idea of escalating our military spending? Do you think that could perhaps like be a self-fulfilling prophecy in times of war? Do you think there's a danger that if we amp up our defense, Russia might do the same, and there might be an escalating, situation in terms of conflict? Is
Of
that
course,
worrying?
that's a possibility, and that's what we see with nuclear weapons, which is why I'm against them.
Yeah,
But if you stand as a politician, you have to be realistic. Take the advice of the security forces and know exactly what the situation is, because hell mend any politician or any party in government that doesn't get this right. It's a bit of realism that has to be seen here.
yeah, totally, yeah. So we'll move on to our next story about the Conservative Party. James Cleverly warns Tories not to descend into bitter infighting. James Cleverly has called for the Conservative Party to unite in opposition as the party heads into what is likely to be a bitter leadership campaign. The Shadow Home Secretary warned his party not to descend into infighting after explosive interviews from his fellow leadership contenders, Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman. The party is about to face a leadership election, which is likely to take months, but is divided over everything from how long the contest should take to why the election was lost. Cleverly, who is seen as a possible leadership contender, wrote in the Times, quote, "We cannot descend into bitter infighting and finger pointing. That is exactly how we end up. That is exactly how we ended up here." In a in a riposte to those riposte, I apologize for my pronunciation, to those who want the Tory party to move to the right, he added, quote, "There is strength in unity, and the Conservative Party has always been at its best when it embraces being a broad church. We've lost voters to the left and the right, and we won't win them back if we narrow our offer." Cleverly's article comes as a poll found that almost half of Conservative grassroots members are in favour of a merger with Nigel Farage's Reform UK, with Kemi Badenoch the favourite to be the next party leader. Data gathered by YouGov since the general election shows the former business secretary, who is said to have been a significant critic of Rishi Sunak's decision to call a summer general election, has twice the grassroots support of Suella Braverman, the hardline former Home Secretary, and Tom Tugendhat, the former Security Minister, who is the frontrunner from the party's centre-right. Badenoch has support from 31% of those polled for the party's members project, ran by researchers at Queen Mary University of London and Sussex University. Others who have been touted as potential leaders have minimal support from party members. Priti Patel gains just 6%, and Robert Jenrick, who has attracted a slew of names in support from the party's right, had about 7% support. James Cleverly, who is thought to be contemplating a bid to present himself as a unity candidate, would be backed by 10% of the party, according to the poll. In Scotland, the Scottish Conservatives are also facing a leadership election after Douglas Ross made history by becoming the first party leader to announce his resignation at the start of the election campaign. So, Maureen, on the leadership contest, what do you make of it so far?
Well, I kind of think we knew this was going to happen as soon as it became clear that the Tories were going to lose the election. And they really are in a no man's land, really. And I think they will split. I can't see any other way. I mean, Reform are to the far right, and there are some leadership candidates who clearly want to embrace reform. So will we see Tories defecting to reform if they're in opposition? Do they, it be the case? Or do they tack to the middle ground, which is where they have been practically all my life, and see whether they can take votes from Labour. But it's a really, really intractable situation, I would say. And I think actually they're quite right to take the time to take the summer recess before party conference season, take the time to decide exactly as a party where they want to be and what they want to do and who they want to have as leader. I mean, I suspect the reason why they wanted the 1922 committee up and running very quickly is to have a discussion about whether the current rules are ones that they really want to follow. I suspect that the rump of the Tory party left in Parliament would like the decision to rest with them, as it has previously before they went to the membership, because it looks like the membership is much further to the right than many of the surviving Tory MPs. So it's a really intractable situation, and I have no idea at this stage how this is going to go. And in terms of Scotland, I've heard them say that they should wait until what happens in England. Well, that just shows you how much of a branch office they are, and I'm not sure that's going to go down very well with Tory MSPs in Scotland, or indeed the wider membership. Does it mean that Murdo Fraser's idea, for example, of breaking away from the Tories south of the border is a good idea? It's going to make a lot of copy for journalists over the recess, which is normally quite a barren time for them, shall we say.
So, do you think that the Tory party had any, like, do you think there's any outcome of leadership competition, meaning if they go right or centre, where the party can sort of do well, or do you think the party's a little bit destined to fail at this point?
Well, I think that it's probably different in the rest of the UK from Scotland, although we have to remember that did quite well in the seat that Douglas Ross was fighting here in the northeast, whose new name I always forget, Aberdeenshire East and Moray West, I think it is. So the answer is, honestly, Ben, I really don't know how this is going to go. But I think we'll see a lot of Tory infighting, which for the main opposition party is not a good situation to be in. And, you know, maybe Nigel Farage and Richard Tice are right that they, when they say that they might form the main opposition party to Labour, regardless of the numbers. They'll probably certainly be the loudest and unfortunately get most of the more airtime from the mainstream media than their five members deserve. But it'll be interesting to see whether the Lib Dems step up to the mark. And we know that the SNP is always ready to provide an effective opposition regardless of numbers.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely looking at Europe is not good for the Conservatives because, you know, the norm of a more right-wing party taking complete control, that we just saw that in France, in Italy, you know, in the Netherlands like last year. So yeah, I don't think it's looking good for the Conservative Party in that regard at all. But looking at time, I'll have to move on to our next story on the National Health Service. Not National Health Service, on climate change. National Health Services after climate change. Chris Stark appointed to elite UK Clean Energy Task Force. Labour's Energy Secretary Ed Miliband has appointed Chris Stark to lead a new Green Energy Task Force. Stark had previously led the UK's Climate Change Committee, CCC, for 6 years until January, and before that was the Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government between 2016 and 2018. During his leadership of the CCC, the organisation recommended the 2050 as the target date for the United Kingdom to reach net zero, and following this decision, this date was put into law by the UK government. Stark led the CCC during challenging times, with the Conservative government often briefing against the organisation's proposals on climate change. And earlier this year, at the time of his departure from the CCC, Stark criticised Conservative Party ministers over their climate policy, warning that the concept of, quote, net zero had turned into a political slogan used to start a, quote, dangerous culture war over climate. Commenting on the appointment, Ed Miliband said, quote, this new mission control center, benefiting from the expertise and experience of Chris Stark's leadership and bringing together the brightest and best in the national interest, will have a laser focus on delivering our mission of clean power by 2030. So, Maureen, what do you make of this appointment? Do you think Labour looks serious in climate change?
I think it's a good appointment. I have great respect for Chris Stark. I think he's a really good guy. And I hope he will keep his feet to the fire in terms of powering ahead with renewable energy, insulation schemes, and all the rest. I suppose his brief will be more about the provision of alternative energy sources. But yes, I think it's a good appointment. You know, if you'd asked me before, I couldn't have thought of anybody better to have this role, and I wish him every success in his role.
Are you surprised by the appointment? You know, given Labour previously went back on its $28 billion pledge on climate.
I know. I'm glad that they've seen the need for such an appointment, and even although they've reneged on the 28 billion, presumably he will have be given some sort of budget to work with. He will probably have negotiated that, hopefully, during his interview for the job. But just like making Mr. Timpson, or the head of Timpson's, in charge of prison reform, I think this is another really good appointment.
So more broadly, just before I move on net zero, do you think that 2050 is a realistic date for net zero? Do you think it's a good idea, or do you think it's not enough time?
I think achieving it is possible. I think it's difficult. A lot of the progress that has been made so far has been, you know, what you might term as the low hanging fruit. And I think I don't think that it will be possible without making great steps toward in insulating homes. I mean, I think that is key, and I've yet to see the amount of investment that's needed to make any real progress on that. And I think in terms of heating your house, I mean, it's still really difficult to try and work out what is the best alternative heating system for your house if you want to move away from oil and gas. And of course, you know, Scotland, although it hasn't met annual targets, which I have to admit that I was never in favour of, because I don't think you can meet annual targets or go up and down in terms of the trajectory of up to Scotland's target of 2045. I think that's still achievable, although having heard the new Labour government say that onshore wind is possible in England, we have to make sure that Scotland still gets its share of investment into renewable energy. And we're, you know, long way along the road of, you know, looking at hydrogen and other alternative sources with our coastline and the type of energy mix that we have. So Scotland needs to be vigilant in terms of getting its fair share.
So moving on to our next story, which is on the NHS. Eye doctors say private cataract operations have hurt the NHS in England. Research has found the vast majority of eye doctors believe increased outsourcing of cataract operations to private clinics in England has negatively affected their NHS departments. Nearly 60% of eye doctors polled said outsourcing had a negative impact on the NHS staffing, 62% for staff training, and 45% said it had harmed the ability of public eye care departments to treat patients with more complex conditions. The survey of 200 eye doctors carried out by the Centre for Health and the Public Interest (CHPI) was released following a pledge by the new Labour Health Secretary Wes Streeting to divert billions of pounds from hospitals to GPs to, quote in his words, fix the front door of the NHS, and to meet junior doctors on Tuesday to try and end the long-running pay dispute and strikes. On average, NHS hospitals are providing about 20% fewer cataract operations than they did 5 years ago, with some trusts performing more than 40% fewer surgeries as they outsourced more to private providers, the CHPI said. This has led to an average 21% reduction in income from cataract surgery for 26 out of the 50 NHS eye care departments. David Rowland, the director of CHPI, said, quote, "The hollowing out of NHS eye care departments due to the loss of income and activity from cataract care has the potential to leave the National Health Service eye care departments as a poor service for poor people, and is significantly undermining the training of that workforce." Scottish Labour's health spokesperson, Jackie Baillie, has been criticised for saying that the Scottish Government should follow the UK Government's plans for more involvement of private healthcare in the NHS. So, Maureen, do you think that now we have a Labour government, it has what it takes to address these systemic issues in eye care and just more broadly in the NHS?
Well, I think it's going to have to address the problems more widely. The worry is, of course, that West was perfectly upfront about it and saying that he wants to involve the private sector more. And we've seen here where the private sector is involved more than other sectors, that the eye care is decreasing in the NHS. The level of eye care is decreasing in the NHS, and we're a two-tier system there, and clearly that's what Labour would like to see in the rest of the NHS. I mean, the problem here is that it is really important for doctors to see a wide range of problems, eye problems. Let's take eye problems, in order to keep up their standard of what's the word? Their standards that they meet. They have to do a certain number of operations and see complicated cases in order to keep up their capability and their license to practice. Now, if more people are being outsourced to the private sector, and does that also mean that the doctors are the ones, the NHS are the ones that are doing it in the private sector, or is it other people? I'm a bit confused about that. Then we are seeing the beginnings of what outsourcing and Wes Streeting's ideas will mean in other parts of the NHS. So I would say for Scotland, where we want to see the NHS stay in public hands, and there for people who need it, it's a very worrying development that's already started under the Tories and looks like continuing under Labour.
So moving on to our next story. Russia issued arrest warrant for Yulia Navalny, widow of Alexei Navalny. Russia has issued an arrest warrant for Yulia Navalny, the widow of Alexei Navalny, and a leading dissident living in exile, imposing a 2-month detention order on grounds that she participated in an extremist group. This warrant was issued in Athens by a Moscow court on Tuesday, 5 months after Navalny died in a Russian Arctic penal colony. Navalny holds the Russian president Vladimir Putin responsible for her husband's death. Since Navalny's death, Navalny has lived in an undisclosed location outside Russia with the couple's 2 children. Writing on X, social media platform on Tuesday, she told her supporters not to be distracted by the court order against her, but to focus on the broader campaign against Putin. Navalny was serving a 19-year prison sentence in the Russian Arctic following his leading role in opposition to Putin. In August 2020, he fell violently ill on a Russian international flight as a result of poisoning with the nerve agent Novichok. He was evacuated to Germany for emergency medical care and recovered. On the 17th of January 2021, Navalny returned to Russia by plane from Germany and was detained on landing in Moscow. 3 days after Navalny's death in custody, the 47-year-old Navalny took on his mantle of leadership, broadcasting a 9-minute video message vowing to continue his resistance to Putin's dictatorial rule. Since taking up the opposition leadership in February, Navalny has met a succession of world leaders, including Joe Biden. Last week, a US-based advocacy group, the Human Rights Foundation, named her as its chair, and she said she would use this position to step up the struggle with Putin. So, Maureen, do you think there any effective way that our country can help out political dissidents in countries like Russia? Any actions our government can take?
Well, we know that even the south of England isn't safe from Putin and his Novichok, because we've seen Russian dissidents being poisoned in England. So I fear for Yulia Navalnya's life, because no doubt there will be agents sent to try and destroy her too. But I think she is one extremely brave woman to step up immediately after her husband was killed by Putin's Russia, and the courage that must take to do that immediately after his death is huge, and it's clear that she is well respected by human rights organizations, and is, I have seen her on television and make speeches. She is a very competent woman, and I really do hope that she and her children are safe.
How worrying do you find this sort of escalation of repression against political dissidents in Russia? And do you think it can continue past this point?
Sorry, what was that last bit?
Do you think sort of going forward, do you think it could even further escalate? Because I remember even 10 years ago in Russia, it wasn't this bad. Especially since the war, it seems to have escalated quite a bit.
Yes, and that goes back to Putin. He has no opposition within Russia. He's been re-elected and re-elected and re-elected. So he thinks he can do whatever he wants. The fact that there are sanctions against Russia has, made him even more determined to root out dissidents wherever they are. And of course, a lot of the wealthy people in Russia have left, and some of them are speaking out against him. And he just wants to close down all dissent, whether it's internally or externally.
Obviously, this is quite a broad question, but how likely or what way do you think, in Russia, how do you think Putin could eventually be removed from power? Do you think there's any way? Do you see any, resistance that could potentially come up to oust him?
Do I think there are dissidents within his government? Possibly there are those who don't like what he's doing but value their life more than the country's future. Is there somebody who is prepared to take that shot at him? We don't know, do we?
So, looking at the time, we'll have to move on to our second last story, a Scottish government story. Scottish government working with organisations and people across Scotland to co-design the National Care Service. The Scottish Government has been working with organisations who support people from groups and communities who often have barriers to engaging with the government. They engaged with these groups as they have not been as well represented in previous co-design work. The Scottish Government say that they want to further discuss topics that emerged during previous co-design sessions. This work is to help them ensure that they are co-designing the National Care Service in a way that will help everybody across Scotland. The findings from the co-design work will be used to inform decisions about the design of the National Care Service programme. The Scottish Government's co-design work for the National Care Service has focused on different themes. Making sure people's voices are heard is one of these themes. Making sure that people's voices are heard when accessing care will empower people to claim their rights, make the choices to live the way they want to live, and to be involved in decisions about their care. The Scottish Government have said it is essential people providing care also have an effective voice, and they want the National Care Service to respond to people's needs and capture the ideas of the people working in it. During the co-design activity for this theme, they have looked at three important areas. Access and support planning. We want to improve the way people can access support. Independent advocacy. We want to enhance independent advocacy provision. Complaints and redress. We want to develop a complaint service that is fair, effective and consistent. The Scottish Government say they remain committed to delivering a national care service to improve quality, fairness and consistency of provision that meets individuals' needs, while at the same time they continue to work on improving the current social care system. So, Maureen, what do you make of the story in general?
Well, I'm guessing that well, when we talk about the National Care Service, we tend to think about care of the elderly. But I'm thinking that this announcement today is about people who need care who are not necessarily elderly, younger people who have disability or need care of some sort. And I think it is the case that despite the fact that we have many organisations in the third sector working or representing people with disabilities, it's difficult to devise a system that meets everybody's individual needs, because everybody is an individual and their needs can be completely different, even with people who have the same condition. So it's a big job to individualize, if you like, the national care system, which is why it's important to speak to as many people as possible at the early stage trying to devise a care system for people who probably want to live as independent lives as possible, and certainly at home or with loved ones who will need support. Or there are people who clearly do need more intensive support, which may well be in in a sort of an individual house adaptations, or with other people with other disabilities with whom they can get along. So it's a really difficult job. And I think the more people that are consulted in the run up to devising a national care system in this setting, in this way, is really important.
So how do you think having a national care service in opposed to the social care services we have now, what difference do you think that'll make for the lives of people who need care?
Well, I think there's quite a lot of money that's probably wasted, and people who need care falling through the traps or the cracks, should we say, in the system. As I said, it's a really difficult job to work out a care system, and at the moment it's subject to each individual local council deciding people need, albeit with national guidelines. But there is a bit of a lottery depending on which council that you're in, and what sort of disabilities
Yeah.
you have. You've heard of people moving from one council area to another because they perceive the system to be better for their child's or their disabilities in that area. So having a national system should do away with these kind of postcode lotteries, hopefully.
But just lastly, before we move on, why do you think it's taken the Scottish Government like such a long time to implement the National Care Service? They've been in power for quite a long time at this point, 17 years, I think.
Yeah, well, they haven't been. It hasn't been 17 years that I've had a policy for developing a national care system. The national care system, as I said initially, has focused mainly on the care of the elderly, where we have very big international organisations providing care at really expensive rates, and the money going out of the country to offshore funds and offshore companies. Whereas, the care system is something that should be local, hopefully provided by local people and local companies. And because there's such a diverse range, whether it's provided by the Church of Scotland, the councils still, charities, or as I say, these big organisations, it's extremely difficult in that situation, that type of care, to get any consensus on any system that will work. And I think that's why it's taken so long. It's really quite intractable, but needs to be done, because otherwise we're going to continue to have people in hospital when they don't need to be,
Yeah.
and seeing backups in A&E, and people not being able to get on wards, because people on wards should be out the door into either care at home, and having care ready for them at home, or maybe into residential care or
Yeah.
whatever.
Do you think it's taken too long to implement it, or do you think it would just always have taken this long given the nature of?
Well, as I said, it's really quite an intractable situation. And, if there was a quick fix, I'm sure it would have been found by now. But I don't think there is. I'm not close enough to it to know exactly what the barriers are. But even from afar, you can see how difficult the situation um, is to a national care system. I mean, because you can't go in and, for example, privatize all the nationalize, sorry, all the private care homes in a winner. That's not going to work. So it's going to be really difficult.
Okay, on to our last story of the night. Scottish Government support to help New Scots settle into communities. The Scottish Government have announced a package of measures to help ensure refugees and people seeking asylum are supported to make their new communities their home. The New Scots Refugee International Strategy Delivery Plan 2024 to 2026, developed by the Scottish Government, Scottish Refugee Council, and COSLA, includes commitments to work with employers to help them recruit refugees, to identify ways to improve English language provision, and to ensure services are coordinated effectively. The plan also aims to ensure people understand their rights, responsibilities, and entitlements, and to help New Scots and communities to integrate. Equalities Minister Caube Stewart said, quote, Scotland has a proud history of welcoming those fleeing war and persecution, and we are dedicated to helping them integrate into communities from the day they arrive in Scotland. It is vital that we support refugees and people seeking asylum to understand their rights and access employment and services to help to rebuild their lives in Scotland. This plan, which was informed by engagement with those with experience of seeking refuge and settling in Scotland, as well as those with expertise in supporting them, lays out the steps we will take to support refugees and people seeking asylum to integrate across different parts of our society. It also recognises the role communities and employers can actively play in supporting people. So, Maureen, what do you make of the new measures? How important do you think that'll be for like, new refugees? I can imagine that must be pretty intense.
I think that it's great that the Scottish Government is um, reviewing the service that is provided to refugees. I think Scotland has a proud record of welcoming refugees and doing as much as possible to see, as you said, get their rights, responsibilities, and entitlements. But I think there are a sufficient number of refugees now. Take for example the numbers that have come from Ukraine,
Mm.
to know how they were dealt with and how the system could be made better so that people, if they want to, can access work more quickly. And, as you pointed out in the press release, working with employers to make sure that they can access work more quickly. And of course, training and language, getting language skills is also really important. So if we can do things better, it's always good that we review what we're doing to make things better.
That is all for this evening. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view, however, if you can afford just £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So thank you again to our guest, Maureen. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye, goodbye, and thanks for watching.